In the dusty town square of Millbrook, Kansas, beneath the scorching August sun of 1892, a crowd gathered around a wooden platform that would forever change the lives of 4 people. What started as a routine debt settlement auction became the moment when 3 innocent children faced a fate worse than death, and one mysterious stranger made a decision that would shock an entire territory. This is the story of how human compassion triumphed over legal cruelty, and how sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the shadows to rewrite destiny itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1892 had been merciless to the residents of Millbrook, Kansas. The wheat crops had withered under an unforgiving drought, cattle had died by the hundreds, and even the most prosperous families found themselves counting pennies with desperate precision. But for the Henderson family, the drought was only the beginning of their troubles. Thomas Henderson had been one of Millbrook's most respected citizens, a successful merchant who owned the largest general store in 3 counties. His wife, Catherine, had been beloved throughout the community for her charitable work and gentle spirit. Their 3 daughters, 12-year-old Margaret, 10-year-old Sarah, and 8-year-old Lucy, had been the pride of the town, known for their intelligence, kindness, and remarkable musical talents. But prosperity has a way of vanishing faster than morning dew in the Kansas heat. It started with Thomas's gambling problem, though few in the community knew about it initially. While Catherine believed her husband was traveling to neighboring towns on business, Thomas was actually frequenting high-stakes poker games in Kansas City, where professional cardsmen separated foolish farmers from their life savings with surgical precision. Thomas convinced himself he could win back the money he'd lost, then win enough to expand his business, perhaps even buy land in California where droughts couldn't destroy a man's dreams. Each loss only fueled his desperation, and each desperate bet led to larger losses. Within 18 months, Thomas had secretly mortgaged his store, his home, and even borrowed against future inventory to fund his gambling addiction. The collapse came suddenly and completely. When the Kansas City creditors arrived in Millbrook with legal documents and armed escorts, the community learned that Thomas Henderson owed nearly $15,000 to men who collected debts with methods that made the law seem gentle. By comparison, Catherine Henderson died of a heart attack the very day the creditors seized their home. Whether it was the shock of discovering her husband's betrayal or the terror of realizing her children faced destitution, no one could say. But she collapsed in the parlor while watching strange men catalog her furniture and possessions, and she never regained consciousness. Thomas lasted 3 days longer. The guilt of destroying his family combined with threats from the creditors proved too much for his shattered mind. He was found hanging in the barn, behind what had once been his prosperous store, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note begging forgiveness from daughters who would never have the chance to grant it. In the span of 1 terrible week, Margaret, Sarah, and Lucy Henderson had lost everything. Their parents, their home, their security, and their place in a community that had once cherished them. But their ordeal was far from over. Kansas law in 1892 was brutally practical when it came to orphaned children with outstanding debts. The Henderson girls were not simply homeless. They were considered assets to be liquidated in service of their father's creditors. The legal system that should have protected them instead treated them as property to be sold to the highest bidder. Judge Ezekiel Thornton, a man whose heart had apparently been carved from the same stone as his courthouse, issued the order without apparent emotion. The Henderson children would be auctioned as indentured servants, with their labor contracts extending until their 21st birthdays. The proceeds would partially satisfy their father's debts, and the girls would receive food, shelter, and basic education from whoever purchased their contracts. The judge presented this arrangement as merciful, claiming it provided the children with guaranteed care while serving the interests of justice. In reality, it was legalized slavery dressed in the language of legal necessity. Word of the auction spread throughout the territory like wildfire. Some people expressed outrage at the inhumanity of selling children to settle debts. Others saw opportunity in acquiring young, educated workers at bargain prices. Still others came simply to witness a spectacle that would be discussed for years to come. The auction was scheduled for August 15th at noon, when the summer sun would be at its most punishing. Judge Thornton claimed the timing was practical. More potential buyers would be available during the midday break from fieldwork. Critics suggested the harsh conditions were designed to discourage attendance and minimize public scrutiny of the proceedings. On the morning of the auction, Margaret Henderson stood at the barred window of the makeshift holding cell behind the courthouse, watching the crowd gather in the town square. At 12, she possessed a maturity far beyond her years, forced into the role of protector and surrogate mother for her younger sisters. Sarah, 10 years old with their mother's gentle eyes and golden hair, had barely spoken since their parents' deaths. She clung to Margaret with desperate intensity, as if physical contact could somehow prevent the further dissolution of their family. Lucy, the youngest at 8, seemed to understand that something terrible was happening but couldn't quite grasp the magnitude of their situation. "Margaret," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing noise from the square, "what's going to happen to us?" Margaret wanted to offer comfort, to promise that everything would be fine, but she'd learned that false hope could be crueler than honest despair. She'd heard the conversations between the sheriff and his deputies, understood that they would likely be separated, sold to different buyers who had no obligation to keep families together. "I don't know," Margaret replied honestly, pulling both sisters closer. "But whatever happens, remember that we're still family. No matter how far apart they take us, no matter what they make us do, we're still the Henderson sisters, and we'll always love each other." Lucy began to cry softly, and Margaret felt her own tears threatening to fall. But she forced herself to remain strong, knowing that her sisters needed her courage more than they needed her sorrow. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. Farmers arrived in wagons loaded with families eager to witness the unusual spectacle. Businessmen from neighboring towns came to evaluate potential investments. Most disturbing of all, several men arrived alone, their eyes holding the kind of predatory gleam that made Margaret's skin crawl with instinctive fear. Among the crowd, heated arguments broke out between those who supported the auction and those who opposed it. Reverend William Matthews of the First Methodist Church had organized a group attempting to raise funds to purchase the girls' contracts and arrange proper adoptions. But $15,000 was an impossible sum for a small Kansas community still struggling with drought-induced poverty. Dr. James Morrison, one of the few educated men in Millbrook, argued passionately with Judge Thornton about the legal and moral implications of the auction. The doctor's wife had died in childbirth years earlier, and he'd been considering adopting the Henderson girls himself. But his medical practice barely generated enough income to support one additional person, let alone 3 growing children. As noon approached, Judge Thornton emerged from the courthouse wearing his black robes and carrying the legal documents that would determine the girls' fate. The crowd pressed closer to the wooden platform that had been erected in the center of the square, while Sheriff Davis and his deputies formed a protective circle around the auction block. The Henderson sisters were escorted from their holding cell by Deputy Marshal Frank Torres, a decent man who'd known their family for years and clearly hated his role in the proceedings. He'd tried to shield them from the crowd's stares and comments, but there was no way to protect them from the psychological trauma of being presented for sale like livestock at a county fair. Margaret walked with her head held high, determined to maintain whatever dignity remained to their family name. Sarah stayed close to her older sister's side, her eyes fixed on the ground to avoid seeing the faces of people who might separate her from the only family she had left. Lucy, confused and frightened, looked around at the crowd with wide eyes that seemed to ask why so many people had come to watch their humiliation. Judge Thornton called for order as the sisters were positioned on the wooden platform. The crowd fell silent, creating an atmosphere so tense it seemed like the very air might shatter from the weight of collective anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge announced in his booming courtroom voice, "we are gathered here today to conduct a lawful auction for the purpose of settling the outstanding debts of the late Thomas Henderson. 3 minor children, Margaret Henderson, age 12, Sarah Henderson, age 10, and Lucy Henderson, age 8, are to be placed in indentured servitude until reaching their majority at age 21. The judge's words echoed across the square like a death sentence. Margaret felt Sarah's hand slip into hers and squeezed it gently, trying to offer what comfort she could while her own heart hammered against her ribs. The successful bidders will assume full responsibility for the children's care, education, and moral development, Judge Thornton continued. In return, they will receive the benefit of the children's labor and service. Contracts may be sold separately or together, depending on the bidder's preferences and financial capabilities. A murmur rippled through the crowd at the mention of separate sales. Many had assumed the sisters would be kept together, but the judge's words made clear that family bonds were secondary to financial considerations. "We'll begin with the eldest child," Judge Thornton announced. "Margaret Henderson is 12 years old, educated through the 8th grade, experienced in household management, cooking, and basic medical care. She's demonstrated exceptional intelligence and leadership abilities. Bidding will start at $50. Margaret felt the world spinning around her as men in the crowd began raising their hands, calling out numbers that represented the price of her childhood, her freedom, her future. $50 became $60, then $75, then $100. Each bid felt like a physical blow, reducing her from a human being to a commodity measured in dollars and cents. The highest bidder for Margaret was Silas Blackwood, a wealthy rancher from the next county who was known for working his employees brutally hard and paying them as little as possible. Blackwood's ranch was isolated, notorious for the harsh conditions endured by anyone unfortunate enough to work. Now if he won Margaret's contract, she would disappear into a life of back-breaking labor with no hope of rescue or escape. Blackwood's final bid was $140, an enormous sum that seemed to guarantee his victory. Judge Thornton prepared to bring down his gavel when a voice from the back of the crowd interrupted the proceedings. $200. Every head turned toward the source of the bid. A tall man in a dark suit pushed through the crowd, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his hat brim. He moved with quiet confidence, seeming oblivious to the shocked stares and whispered conversations that followed his progress toward the platform. Margaret had never seen him before, but something in his bearing suggested intelligence, education, and perhaps most importantly, genuine concern for her welfare rather than mere calculation of her potential value as a worker. Silas Blackwood's face darkened with anger at being outbid by a stranger. $225, he shouted, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that suggested he viewed Margaret's contract as essential to his plans. The mysterious stranger didn't hesitate. $300. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. $300 was more money than most families in Millbrook saw in an entire year. The stranger was bidding as if money meant nothing to him, as if his primary concern was ensuring Margaret's welfare rather than acquiring cheap labor. Blackwood's face went through several color changes as he calculated whether he could afford to continue the bidding war. $300 was already far more than any child's labor could justify from a purely economic standpoint. Going higher would represent pure stubbornness rather than sound business judgment. "Going once, Judge," Thornton announced, his own surprise evident in his voice. "Going twice." The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Margaret realized that her fate had been decided by a complete stranger whose motivations remained entirely mysterious. But the auction was far from over. Sarah and Lucy still stood on the platform, watching their sisters sail with mounting terror as they realized their own turns were approaching. The nightmare that had begun with their father's gambling addiction was about to separate them from the only family they had left, scattering them to unknown fates across the Kansas territory. The mysterious stranger had saved Margaret from Silas, Blackwood's brutal ranch, but who would save Sarah and Lucy? And what did this enigmatic man actually intend to do with a 12-year-old girl whose childhood had just been purchased for $300? As the bidding for Sarah began, Margaret caught the stranger's eye and saw something there that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the predatory gleam she'd feared, nor the calculating assessment of a new employer evaluating his investment. Instead, it was something that looked almost like compassion. But in a world where children could be sold like cattle, Margaret had learned not to trust appearances. Whatever this man's intentions, her life was now entirely in his hands, and the lives of her sisters hung in the balance of what would happen next. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The August sun climbed higher as Judge Thornton's gavel struck the platform, sealing Margaret's fate with the mysterious stranger. But the crowd's attention immediately shifted to 10-year-old Sarah Henderson, who stood trembling on the auction block while her older sister was led away to an uncertain future. Sarah's golden hair caught the sunlight like spun wheat, and her resemblance to her late mother Catherine sent murmurs of recognition through the gathered townspeople. Many remembered Catherine Henderson's kindness during their own difficult times, how she'd brought food to sick families, helped with difficult births, and never turned away anyone seeking help at their store. Now Catherine's daughter stood before them as merchandise to be sold to the highest bidder. "Sarah Henderson," Judge Thornton announced with mechanical efficiency, age 10, educated through the 6th grade, skilled in domestic arts, needlework, and musical instruction. The child has demonstrated exceptional aptitude for learning and possesses a gentle temperament suitable for household service. Bidding begins at $40. The opening bid came from Mrs. Cordelia Hartwell, a widow who owned a boarding house on the outskirts of town. Hartwell had a reputation for treating her employees fairly, but she was also known to work them from dawn to dusk without respite. Her boarding house catered to traveling salesmen and occasional drifters, requiring constant cleaning, cooking, and maintenance. $40, Mrs. Hartwell called out, her voice carrying across the square with business-like authority. Almost immediately, a competing bid emerged from an unexpected source. Dr. James Morrison stepped forward, his medical bag still in hand from his morning rounds. The town's only physician had lost his own wife years earlier and had no children of his own. His bid of $50 sent surprised whispers through the crowd. $60, came a harsh voice from the crowd's edge. Jeremiah Walsh, a farmer, known for his violent temper and harsh treatment of hired hands, pushed forward with predatory determination. Walsh's farm was isolated, his nearest neighbors miles away, and stories circulated about workers who'd arrived at his property but never been seen in town again. Dr. Morrison's face darkened as he recognized Walsh's bid. The physician knew Walsh's reputation and understood the implications for young Sarah's welfare. $75, Morrison countered, his voice steady but urgent. The bidding continued to escalate, each increase representing not just money, but Sarah's future treatment and survival. Mrs. Hartwell dropped out at $85, unable to justify the expense for her boarding house operation. The contest narrowed to Dr. Morrison and Jeremiah Walsh, two men whose intentions couldn't have been more different. Walsh raised his bid to $100, a sum that represented significant investment for a farmer struggling with drought-damaged crops. His persistence suggested motivations beyond simple labor acquisition, implications that made several people in the crowd visibly uncomfortable. Dr. Morrison hesitated. His medical practice provided steady income, but supporting an additional child would strain his finances considerably. $100 was already more than he could comfortably afford, and Walsh seemed prepared to bid even higher. Into this tense standoff came an unexpected intervention, $150. The same mysterious stranger who'd purchased Margaret's contract had returned to the auction platform. He stood calmly at the crowd's edge, his expression unreadable, beneath the shadow of his hat brim. The bid was substantial enough to silence all competition immediately. Jeremiah Walsh's face contorted with rage at being outbid twice by the same man. "Who are you?" Walsh demanded, pushing through the crowd toward the stranger. "What's your business with these children?" The stranger didn't retreat as Walsh approached aggressively. Instead, he stood his ground with quiet confidence that suggested familiarity with confrontation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an educated accent that marked him as someone from outside Kansas. "My business is my own," the stranger replied calmly. "The auction is legal and public. Any qualified bidder may participate." Walsh's hand moved toward the knife on his belt, but Sheriff Davis stepped between the two men before violence could erupt. The lawman had been watching the stranger carefully since his first bid, trying to determine his identity and motivations. "That's enough, Walsh," Sheriff Davis said firmly. "This is a legal proceeding, not a brawl. Step back." Judge Thornton, eager to maintain order and complete the auction, brought his gavel down decisively. "Sold to the gentleman for $150. Sarah was led from the platform to join her sister Margaret, both girls now belonging to a man whose name they didn't even know. As they stood together under the watchful eye of Deputy Torres, Margaret whispered urgently to Sarah, "Stay close to me no matter what happens. We don't know anything about this man, but at least we're still together." Sarah nodded, finding comfort in her sister's presence, even as anxiety about their future gnawed at her stomach. The stranger had outbid men like Walsh and Blackwood, suggesting either great wealth or powerful motivation. But wealth didn't guarantee kindness, and motivation could be benevolent or sinister. 8-year-old Lucy Henderson was the final child to be auctioned. As the youngest and smallest, she presented both advantages and disadvantages to potential buyers. Her youth meant longer potential service, but also greater care requirements and years before she could perform meaningful labor. Lucy stood on the platform with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the crowd, the heat, and the incomprehensible events that had destroyed her family. She clutched a small rag doll, the only possession she'd been allowed to keep from her former life. "Lucy Henderson," Judge Thornton announced, his voice showing the first signs of weariness after hours in. "The brutal son, age 8, basic education, good health, suitable for light domestic duties, and future training in various skills. Bidding begins at $30. The opening bid came from Samuel Pierce, who owned a textile mill in the next county. Pierce employed dozens of children in his factory, taking advantage of their small fingers and willingness to work for minimal wages. His mills were notorious for dangerous conditions and frequent accidents that left young workers maimed or killed. $30, Pierce called out, his voice carrying the casual indifference of someone accustomed to acquiring human labor in bulk quantities. Mrs. Adelaide Foster, who ran the county's orphanage, entered a competing bid of $35. The orphanage was overcrowded and underfunded, but it offered education and basic care without the brutal working conditions of Pierce's mill. Foster's bid represented genuine concern for Lucy's welfare rather than economic exploitation. The bidding proceeded slowly, with Pierce incrementally increasing his offers while Mrs. Foster struggled to match them. The orphanage's limited budget couldn't compete with the profits generated by child labor in industrial operations. At $55, Mrs. Foster reached her absolute limit. The orphanage simply couldn't afford higher amounts without compromising. Or care for the dozens of other children already in their custody. She stepped back with visible regret, knowing she'd condemned Lucy to a fate she couldn't prevent. Samuel Pierce smiled with satisfaction, preparing to claim his newest worker. Children Lucy's age were particularly valuable in textile operations because their small hands could operate machinery that adult workers couldn't access. The fact that she was orphaned and alone made her even more attractive, as there would be no family members to investigate poor treatment or demand better conditions. $60, Pierce announced confidently, certain that no one would challenge his bid for such a young child. Judge Thornton raised his gavel, preparing to finalize the sale that would send Lucy into industrial servitude. Going once, $200. The mysterious stranger had intervened again, his third dramatic bid silencing the entire crowd. $200 for an 8-year-old represented an investment so large it defied rational explanation. No amount of labor could justify such an expense, suggesting the stranger's motivations were entirely separate from economic considerations. Samuel Pierce's confident expression crumbled into disbelief and rage. "This is absurd," he shouted. "No! One pays $200 for a child that age. Something illegal is happening here." Sheriff Davis moved closer to Pierce, his hand resting on his gun belt. "The auction is legal and properly supervised. Unless you can match the bid, you need to accept the outcome." Pierce looked around desperately for support, but found none. Even other potential buyers were staring at the stranger with mixtures of suspicion and amazement. $200 was an enormous sum that suggested either limitless wealth or dangerous obsession. Judge Thornton, overwhelmed by the day's unusual events, brought his gavel down with finality. Sold to the gentleman for $200, Lucy was escorted from the platform to join her sisters, completing the stranger's acquisition of all 3 Henderson children. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the mysterious man approached Deputy Torres to complete the necessary paperwork and financial transactions. For the first time, people could observe the stranger closely as he conducted his business. He was tall and well-dressed, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His clothes were expensive, but not ostentatious, suggesting prosperity without vulgarity. Most importantly, when the 3 sisters were formally transferred to his custody, his demeanor changed completely. The cold calculation he displayed during the bidding process was replaced by gentle concern as he knelt to address the frightened children. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice kind but serious. "I know you're scared and confused, and you have every right to be. But I want you to understand that you're safe now. No one is going to hurt you or separate you again." Margaret studied his face carefully, searching for signs of deception or hidden cruelty. She'd learned to read adult expressions during the weeks since her parents' deaths, recognizing the difference between genuine concern and manipulative pretense. What she saw in Daniel Whitmore's eyes was something she hadn't dared hope for. Authentic, compassion combined with determination to protect them. But years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious with trust. "What do you want with us?" Margaret asked directly, her voice steady despite her fear. Daniel smiled sadly at her question. "What I want is to give you back your childhood, your education, and your futures. But that's going to take time, and you'll have to trust me before you can believe me." As the crowd began to disperse, people continued staring at Daniel Whitmore and the three sisters he'd purchased for the astronomical sum of $650. Conversations erupted across the square as residents tried to understand what they'd witnessed. Some speculated that Whitmore was a wealthy philanthropist who'd traveled to Kansas specifically to rescue the Henderson children. Others suggested darker possibilities, wondering why any man would spend so much money on three young girls unless his intentions were sinister. Sheriff Davis approached the group, his lawman's instincts demanding answers. "Mr. Whitmore, I'll need to see proper identification and verify your ability to provide appropriate care for these children." Daniel reached into his jacket and produced a leather wallet containing official documents. "Of course, Sheriff. I'm prepared to answer any questions you might have about my qualifications or intentions." As Sheriff Davis examined the papers, his eyebrows rose with surprise. The documents identified Daniel Whitmore as a federal marshal from Colorado Territory, currently on special assignment investigating child labor violations and human trafficking. Operations throughout the Western Territories. The revelation changed everything. Whitmore wasn't a mysterious stranger with unknown motivations. He was a law enforcement officer whose presence in Millbrook was part of an official investigation. His dramatic bidding wasn't personal obsession, but professional duty. But this information raised new questions. If Whitmore was investigating illegal activities involving children, what had he discovered about conditions in Kansas? Were the auctions themselves under federal scrutiny? And what did his intervention mean for the future of similar proceedings throughout the territory? The answers would have to wait. For now, three orphaned sisters found themselves in the custody of a man who'd spent more money than most people, earned in 5 years, to ensure their safety. Whether his promises of protection and restored futures would prove genuine remained to be seen. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, Kansas, the most unusual auction in the territory's history had concluded. But the real story was just beginning, and its implications would extend far beyond 3 children and one mysterious federal marshal. The Henderson sisters were about to discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and that their ordeal was far from over. It was about to transform into something none of them could have imagined. 3 hours after the auction's conclusion, Federal Marshal Daniel Whitmore sat across from Sheriff Davis in the cramped office behind Millbrook's courthouse, while the Henderson sisters waited under Deputy Torres's supervision in the adjacent room. The official documents spread across. The sheriff's desk painted a disturbing picture of corruption that extended far beyond Kansas territory. "This investigation has been ongoing for 8 months, Daniel explained, his voice low to prevent the children from overhearing. "We've documented similar auctions in Missouri, Nebraska, and Colorado. Children sold as indentured servants, many of them disappearing into mining camps, textile mills, and isolated ranches where no one monitors their treatment." Sheriff Davis studied the federal warrant with growing unease. The document authorized Daniel to investigate systematic violations of federal statutes regarding child welfare and interstate commerce in human labor. The legal language was dry, but its implications were staggering. "You're saying this isn't just about settling debts?" Davis asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Judge Thornton has presided over 17 similar auctions in the past 2 years, Daniel replied, producing a leather-bound ledger from his satchel. Every case involved families destroyed by gambling debts, suspicious deaths, or sudden financial ruin. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. The ledger contained meticulous records of children sold throughout the region, with detailed notes about their purchases and subsequent fates. Some entries were marked with red ink, indicating children who died in industrial accidents or simply vanished from their assigned locations. The scope of the operation was breathtaking in its cruelty and efficiency. My superiors believe Judge Thornton is working with professional gamblers and debt collectors to create artificial orphan situations. Daniel continued. Families are deliberately targeted and destroyed to generate children for the labor market. Thomas Henderson's gambling problem wasn't random. He was specifically recruited and manipulated into debt by operators who knew his family situation. Sheriff Davis felt his stomach turn as the implications became clear. The Henderson family's tragedy hadn't been unfortunate circumstance, but calculated predation designed to harvest 3 intelligent, educated children for profitable exploitation. Vincent Morrison, Davis said suddenly, recognizing a name from Daniel's records. He was in Millbrook 6 months ago, running high-stakes games, cleaned out several local men before disappearing overnight. Daniel's expression darkened. Morrison is one of our primary targets. He travels from town to town, identifies vulnerable families, and systematically destroys them through manipulated gambling sessions. The children generated by his operations are sold through Thornton's auctions to buyers throughout the Western Territories. The federal marshal opened another file containing photographic evidence from previous investigations. The images showed children working in dangerous conditions, young girls operating textile machinery with missing safety guards, boys barely 8 years old hauling coal buckets in mine shafts, children injured and exhausted beyond their capacity to endure. Samuel Pierce's textile mill has killed 4 children in the past year, Daniel said, pointing to one particularly disturbing photograph. Jeremiah Walsh owns 3 farms where purchased children are worked to death and buried in unmarked graves. These aren't isolated incidents. They're systematic operations designed to exploit legal loopholes regarding indentured servitude. Sheriff Davis pushed back from his desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of corruption his community had unknowingly participated in. What happens now to the children, to Thornton, to all of this? That depends on several factors, Daniel replied. My immediate priority is protecting Margaret, Sarah, and Lucy while gathering evidence to prosecute the entire network. But I need your help to maintain my cover and continue the investigation. The marshal's plan was complex but necessary. He would publicly maintain the pretense of being a wealthy buyer who'd acquired the Henderson sisters for legitimate purposes. Privately, he would document Thornton's activities while protecting the children from the fate that had befallen so many others. I've arranged temporary lodging at the Riverside Inn, Daniel explained. The children will stay there under assumed identities while I complete my investigation. They'll receive proper education, medical care, and counseling to help them recover from their trauma. But the investigation faced significant obstacles. Judge Thornton wielded considerable political influence throughout the region, with connections to territorial government officials who benefited from the cheap labor his auctions provided. Challenging him directly would alert the entire network and potentially endanger witnesses before cases could be built against them. In the adjacent room, the Henderson sisters sat in uncomfortable silence, trying to process the day's extraordinary events. Margaret maintained her protective stance between her younger sisters and the door, while Sarah and Lucy huddled together for comfort and security. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" Sarah whispered, referring to Daniel's promises of safety and protection. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I don't know, but he stopped Walsh and Pierce from buying us, and that has to mean something." Lucy, exhausted by emotional strain and confusion, had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder. At 8 years old, she possessed only limited understanding of their situation, but she instinctively recognized that their lives had changed dramatically. Deputy Torres, who'd known the Henderson family for years, watched the children with evident sympathy. He'd opposed the auction from the beginning, arguing that families should be kept together through community support rather than legal dissolution. But his protests had been overruled by Judge Thornton's interpretation of territorial law. "Mr. Whitmore seems like a good man," Torres said quietly to Margaret. "I've been watching him since he arrived, and his concern for you girls appears genuine." Margaret nodded, but remained cautious. Adults had disappointed her repeatedly since her parents' deaths, and she'd learned to trust actions rather than words. Daniel Whitmore's dramatic bidding had saved them from clearly dangerous situations, but his ultimate intentions remained unclear. Daniel emerged from his conference with Sheriff Davis, carrying additional documents and wearing an expression of grim determination. He approached the children with the same gentle demeanor he displayed at the auction, kneeling to address them at eye level. "I know this has been an overwhelming day," he said softly. "You've been through experiences that no children should endure, and you have every right to be frightened and confused. I want to explain what's going to happen next." Margaret straightened, preparing to hear their fate. "Are you taking us away from Millbrook?" "Not far," Daniel replied. "There's a boarding house about an hour's ride from here where you'll stay. While I complete some business in the area, you'll have comfortable rooms, good food, and opportunities to continue your education." The prospect of education immediately caught Margaret's attention. She'd feared that being sold into indentured servitude would end her academic pursuits permanently. "Real school, with books and proper teachers." "Real school," Daniel confirmed. "You're intelligent children who deserve every opportunity to develop your abilities. What happened to your family was tragic, but it doesn't have to define the rest of your lives." Sarah looked up hopefully. "Will we stay together?" "Absolutely," Daniel said firmly. "You're sisters, and families should remain together whenever possible. That's not negotiable." As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Daniel took additional precautions to protect the children's identities and location. He'd already arranged for a closed carriage to transport them discreetly, and the Riverside Inn's proprietor had been briefed on the need for absolute confidentiality. Judge Thornton emerged from his chambers as the group prepared to depart, his expression showing irritation at the day's unusual developments. The federal marshal's intervention had disrupted carefully established procedures, introducing variables that threatened the entire operation's stability. "Mr. Whitmore," Thornton said with forced courtesy, "I trust you understand the full implications of your purchases today. These children are your legal responsibility until they reach majority. Their care, education, and moral development rest entirely in your hands." Daniel met the judge's gaze steadily. "I understand completely, Your Honor. I take the welfare of children very seriously." The brief exchange carried undertones that only Daniel and Sheriff Davis fully understood. Thornton was asserting his legal authority while subtly threatening consequences for any challenges to the established system. Daniel was accepting responsibility while making clear his intention to protect his charges from further exploitation. As the carriage rolled away from Millbrook's courthouse, the Henderson sisters watched their hometown disappear through the window. They were leaving behind everything familiar: their parents' graves, their former home, the community that had known them since birth. But they were also escaping fates that would have destroyed them systematically and completely. Samuel Pierce's textile mill, Jeremiah Walsh's isolated farm, Silas Blackwood's brutal ranch, all represented variations of legalized slavery that had consumed countless other children throughout the territory. The ride to the Riverside Inn took them through countryside devastated by drought and economic hardship. Abandoned farms dotted the landscape, their empty houses and barns serving as monuments to families destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Some of those families had undoubtedly produced children who'd been sold at auctions similar to the one the Henderson sisters had just escaped. "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said, as their carriage approached the inn. "Why did you save us?" "Really save us, I mean. What do you want in return?" Daniel considered his answer carefully. The children deserved honesty, but revealing his full identity and mission could endanger both them and his investigation. "I want you to have the childhood and future that were stolen from you. Sometimes adults fail to protect children the way they should, and when that happens, other adults have to step in and try to make things right." The Riverside Inn appeared through the gathering dusk, its windows glowing with warm lamplight that promised safety and comfort after a day of terror and uncertainty. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, the proprietor, waited on the front porch with the welcoming smile that had made her establishment famous throughout the region for hospitality and discretion. As the Henderson sisters stepped from the carriage into their new temporary home, they carried with them both hope and apprehension about what lay ahead. Daniel Whitmore had saved them from immediate danger, but their ultimate future remained uncertain. Behind them in Millbrook, Judge Thornton was already planning his response to the day's disruptions. Federal intervention threatened not just his personal operations, but an entire network of corruption that generated enormous profits through the systematic exploitation of orphaned children. The investigation was about to become far more dangerous than anyone anticipated, and the Henderson sisters would find themselves at the center of a conflict that would determine the fate of countless other children throughout the American frontier. The Riverside Inn sat nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees along the banks of the Arkansas River, its whitewashed walls and wraparound porch offering a stark contrast to the harsh realities the Henderson sisters had endured. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez greeted them with the warmth of someone who understood that healing required both safety and genuine care. "Welcome, dear ones," she said, in accented English, her voice carrying the musical cadences of her native Mexico. "Your rooms are prepared, and supper will be ready shortly. You must be exhausted after such a difficult day." The inn's interior reflected Mrs. Rodriguez's attention to comfort and detail. Hand-woven rugs covered polished wooden floors, while oil paintings depicting peaceful landscapes adorned the walls. Fresh flowers filled ceramic vases, and the aroma of baking bread drifted from the kitchen, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that the sisters hadn't experienced since their parents' deaths. Margaret, Sarah, and Lucy were shown to adjoining rooms on the second floor, each furnished with comfortable beds, writing desks, and bookshelves filled with volumes appropriate for their ages. Clean nightgowns had been laid out, along with wash basins filled with warm water and soap that smelled of lavender. For the first time in weeks, the sisters could bathe properly, change into clean clothes, and sleep in actual beds rather than the cold floor of the courthouse holding cell. These simple comforts felt like miraculous luxuries after their recent ordeal. But even in the safety of the inn, Margaret couldn't completely relax. She remained vigilant, listening for sounds that might indicate danger or deception. Too many adults had failed them recently for her to trust easily, regardless of Daniel Whitmore's apparent kindness or Mrs. Rodriguez's genuine hospitality. During supper in the inn's cozy dining room, Daniel explained more about their immediate situation, while carefully avoiding details that might frighten the children or compromise his investigation. "You'll stay here while I complete my business in the area," he said, serving them portions of Mrs. Rodriguez's excellent beef stew. "Mrs. Rodriguez has agreed to provide tutoring in reading, writing, and arithmetic. She was a school teacher in Mexico before coming to Kansas." Sarah's eyes brightened at the mention of formal education. "Real lessons? With actual textbooks?" "Real lessons," Daniel confirmed. You've all fallen behind due to recent circumstances, but intelligence isn't something that can be taken away from you. With proper instruction, you'll catch up quickly." Lucy, who'd been quietly eating her stew, looked up with a question that revealed her fundamental confusion about their situation. "Are we your children now, like adopted?" The question caught Daniel off guard, forcing him to navigate between legal realities and emotional truths. Technically, he owned their indenture contracts, making them his legal property rather than his children. But explaining such complexities to an 8-year-old seemed both unnecessary and cruel. "Right now, I'm responsible for taking care of you," Daniel said carefully. "The most important thing is that you're safe together and able to return to being children instead of worrying about adult problems." Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been listening from the kitchen doorway, approached with dessert plates filled with fresh apple pie. Her expression showed understanding of the delicate emotional dynamics at work among her new guests. "Children," she said gently, "sometimes life takes unexpected turns that seem frightening at first. But Mr. Whitmore is a good man who wants to help you heal from the terrible things that have happened. You don't need to understand everything immediately. Just allow yourselves to feel safe and loved." After supper, Daniel met privately with Mrs. Rodriguez to discuss the children's care and the precautions necessary to protect their identities. The inn's proprietor had extensive experience with guests requiring discretion, having sheltered escaped slaves during the Underground Railroad years and provided sanctuary for families fleeing various forms of persecution. "They're traumatized," Mrs. Rodriguez observed, her professional experience as both teacher and caregiver evident in her assessment. "The oldest girl especially carries tremendous responsibility for her sister's welfare. She won't relax until she's convinced they're truly safe." Daniel nodded, having reached similar conclusions about Margaret's psychological state. "How long do you think recovery will take?" "Months, possibly years," Mrs. Rodriguez replied honestly. "Children are resilient, but they've lost everything. Familiar, parents, home, community, security. Rebuilding trust takes time, especially when adults have repeatedly failed them." The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the inn's front door. Daniel immediately tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun concealed beneath his jacket. Late-night visitors rarely brought good news, particularly during sensitive investigations. Mrs. Rodriguez opened the door to reveal Deputy Torres, his face flushed from hard riding and his expression showing genuine alarm. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to know what's happening in town. Judge Thornton is planning something." Daniel invited the deputy inside, ensuring the children couldn't overhear their conversation. Torres had proven sympathetic to the Henderson sisters' plight, making him a potential ally in the developing conflict with local corruption. "What kind of plans?" Daniel asked. "Thornton sent telegrams to the territorial capital tonight," Torres explained, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Rodriguez. "I couldn't read them all, but I caught references to federal interference and requests for official investigation into your credentials and authority." The news confirmed Daniel's fears about Thornton's political connections. The judge was mobilizing higher authorities to challenge federal jurisdiction, potentially forcing a premature end to the investigation before sufficient evidence could be gathered. "There's more," Torres continued. "Jeremiah Walsh and Samuel Pierce met with Thornton after you left. They're claiming the auction was conducted improperly and demanding the children be returned for resale." Daniel felt his anger rising at the thought of Walsh and Pierce still pursuing the Henderson sisters despite their failed bids. The men's persistence suggested motivations beyond simple labor acquisition, implications that made his protective instincts surge with dangerous intensity. "Do they have legal grounds for such claims?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. "Probably not," Torres admitted, but Thornton has ways of interpreting territorial law that favor his preferred outcomes. If he receives support from the capital, he might be able to void the sales and conduct new auctions. The prospect of the Henderson sisters being returned to the courthouse and resold to the highest bidders was unthinkable. Daniel had invested too much effort in their rescue to allow political maneuvering to undo everything he'd accomplished. But challenging Thornton directly would expose Daniel's true identity and mission, potentially compromising the broader investigation into child trafficking throughout the region. Protecting 3 specific children while potentially sacrificing dozens of others created moral complexities that had no easy resolution. "What about Sheriff Davis?" Daniel asked. "Can he provide any protection or legal support?" Torres shook his head grimly. "Davis is a good man, but he's elected locally and depends on community support. If Thornton convinces people that federal agents are interfering with legitimate territorial governance, Davis will have to distance himself from your actions." The deputy's assessment highlighted the political isolation Daniel faced in his mission. Federal authority meant little without local cooperation, and local cooperation disappeared quickly when economic interests were threatened. As Torres prepared to return to town, he offered additional information that further complicated the situation. Vincent Morrison returned to Millbrook this evening. He's staying at Thornton's house as a personal guest. Daniel's blood chilled at the news. Morrison's presence wasn't coincidental. The professional gambler was there to coordinate responses to federal interference and protect the network that generated his victims. His return meant the investigation had been discovered, and countermeasures were already being implemented. After Torres departed, Daniel found himself facing strategic decisions that would determine both the children's immediate safety and the investigation's ultimate success. Remaining at the inn provided temporary security, but left them vulnerable to legal challenges that could force their return to Thornton's custody. Moving the children to federal territory would ensure their protection, but might prompt violent retaliation against witnesses and evidence before cases could be completed. The timing was crucial. Too early meant incomplete prosecutions. Too late meant potential disaster for everyone involved. Mrs. Rodriguez, sensing Daniel's internal conflict, offered her own perspective on the developing crisis. "In Mexico, I learned that sometimes protection requires difficult choices between immediate safety and long-term justice. What matters most? Saving these 3 children or stopping the system that creates victims like them?" The question struck at the heart of Daniel's dilemma. His personal attachment to Margaret, Sarah, and Lucy made him want to prioritize their individual welfare above broader considerations. But his professional duty demanded actions that served the greater good, even if specific individuals might suffer as a result. Upstairs, the Henderson sisters were settling into their comfortable beds for the first night of genuine safety they'd experienced in weeks. Margaret lay awake listening to her sister's peaceful breathing, finally allowing herself to hope that their ordeal might truly be ending. But in Millbrook, forces were already mobilizing to reclaim what they considered stolen property. Judge Thornton, Vincent Morrison, and their allies wouldn't accept federal interference without a fight, and that fight was about to escalate beyond anything Daniel had anticipated. The sanctuary of the Riverside Inn represented a temporary respite in a conflict that was far from over. The Henderson sisters were safe for now, but their ultimate fate would depend on battles being fought in courtrooms, telegraph offices, and the shadowy networks where children's lives were bought and sold like commodities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions that would test everyone's commitment to justice, mercy, and the fundamental belief that children deserve protection rather than exploitation. The real fight for the Henderson sisters' future was just beginning. Dawn came too early to the Riverside Inn, brought by the thundering hooves of 6 mounted men who surrounded the building before Mrs. Rodriguez could even light her morning cooking fire. The Henderson sisters awoke to shouting voices and the ominous sound of boots on the front porch, their brief respite from fear shattered by the return of immediate danger. Daniel emerged from his room fully dressed and armed, having spent the night expecting exactly this kind of confrontation. Through the window, he could see the riders wore no official badges, but their coordinated movements and expensive weapons suggested professional enforcement rather than random violence. "Federal Marshal Whitmore," came a commanding voice from outside. "This is Captain Wade Hutchinson of the Kansas Territorial Guard. You are ordered to surrender custody of the Henderson children immediately and return with us to Millbrook for questioning regarding violations of territorial jurisdiction." Margaret crept to her bedroom window and peered through the curtains at the armed men below. Their leader was a tall, weathered man whose military bearing and cold eyes reminded her unpleasantly of the predators who'd bid on her at the auction. These weren't local farmers or shopkeepers. They were hardened professionals who'd come to take the sisters back by force if necessary. "Stay away from the windows," Daniel called quietly to the children. "Get dressed quickly, but don't make any noise." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the hallway, carrying a shotgun that looked well maintained and frequently used. Her transformation from gentle innkeeper to determined defender was startling, but somehow reassuring to the frightened children. "The back stairs lead to the kitchen," she whispered to Daniel. "From there, the root cellar connects to a tunnel that emerges near the river. It was built during the slave-running days." Daniel nodded grimly, recognizing that their sanctuary had become a trap. Captain Hutchinson's presence confirmed his worst fears about the political reach of Thornton's corruption network. The Territorial Guard answered to officials in the capital who apparently viewed federal intervention as a threat to local authority. "Marshal Whitmore," Hutchinson called again, his voice carrying the impatience of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "You have 5 minutes to surrender the children before we enter the building and retrieve them ourselves." Through the thin walls, Daniel could hear the men positioning themselves at all exits, eliminating any chance of conventional escape. But Mrs. Rodriguez's mention of underground passages offered possibilities that the Territorial Guard wouldn't anticipate. "I'm a federal officer conducting an authorized investigation," Daniel shouted back, buying time while formulating plans. "You have no authority to interfere with federal operations." Hutchinson's laugh carried no humor. "Your federal authority means nothing in Kansas territory when you're violating local law and kidnapping children from their legal guardians. Judge Thornton has filed formal complaints with the territorial governor, and we're here to enforce his orders." The legal reasoning was flawed but politically effective. By framing Daniel's rescue as kidnapping and his investigation as federal overreach, Thornton had successfully mobilized territorial authorities against outside interference. The children's welfare was irrelevant to officials focused on maintaining local control over profitable operations. Margaret understood enough of the conversation to realize they were about to be taken back to Judge Thornton and potentially resold to the men Daniel had outbid. The prospect filled her with despair that threatened to overwhelm her fragile hope for freedom and safety. "We're not going back," she whispered fiercely to her sisters. "Whatever happens, we stay together and we don't go back to that courthouse." Sarah and Lucy nodded with determination that would have made their parents proud. Despite their youth and fear, they possessed the Henderson family courage that had sustained previous generations through countless challenges. Mrs. Rodriguez led them quietly down the back stairs, while Daniel continued his verbal sparring with Captain Hutchinson. The kitchen was dark and silent, but warm from the banked coals in the cooking stove. A trapdoor near the pantry opened to reveal stone steps leading into underground darkness. "The tunnel is about 50 yards long," Mrs. Rodriguez explained in barely audible whispers. "Follow it straight until you reach another set of stairs. That leads to an old hunter's cabin by the river where horses are kept for emergencies." Daniel checked his pocket watch, calculating how much time remained before Hutchinson's patience expired. The Territorial Guard captain hadn't achieved his position through excessive mercy or hesitation. When his deadline arrived, he would act with decisive violence. "What about you?" Margaret asked Mrs. Rodriguez, unwilling to abandon another adult who'd shown them kindness. "I'll delay them as long as possible," the innkeeper replied with a smile that didn't reach her worried eyes. "They won't hurt an old woman who claims ignorance about your whereabouts." The statement was probably optimistic, but Mrs. Rodriguez had obviously faced dangerous situations before and survived through courage and intelligence. Her willingness to risk herself for their protection demonstrated the same selfless dedication that Daniel had shown at the auction. As the Henderson sisters descended into the tunnel, they could hear Hutchinson's voice growing more threatening. "2 minutes, Marshal! Then we come in shooting!" The underground passage was narrow, damp, and completely dark except for the faint glow of Daniel's oil lamp. The walls were rough stone that scraped against their clothes as they moved carefully toward uncertain freedom. Water dripped from somewhere overhead, and the air smelled of earth and old timber. Lucy stumbled twice in the darkness, her shorter legs struggling to maintain pace with the older children. Margaret helped her sister while fighting down panic about what would happen if the Territorial Guard discovered their escape route. Underground pursuit would leave them trapped with no possibility of evasion. Behind them, the sounds of confrontation escalated dramatically, shouting voices, splintering wood, and Mrs. Rodriguez's angry protests in rapid Spanish indicated that Hutchinson had lost patience with negotiations. The search of the inn had begun, and discovery of the tunnel entrance was probably only minutes away. "Faster," Daniel urged, though he could see the children were already moving as quickly as possible in the difficult conditions. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching through damp darkness while pursuit grew closer behind them. Finally, stone steps appeared in the lamplight, leading upward to a wooden door that might represent either freedom or another trap. Daniel extinguished the lamp before carefully opening the door, revealing the interior of a small cabin that smelled of disuse and old leather. Dawnlight filtered through dirty windows, illuminating rough furniture and supplies left by previous fugitives who'd used this route to escape various forms of persecution. 3 horses waited in a makeshift corral behind the cabin, saddled and ready for immediate departure. Mrs. Rodriguez had clearly anticipated the need for rapid evacuation and prepared accordingly. Her foresight might be the difference between escape and recapture. As Daniel helped the children mount their horses, the sound of pursuit emerged from the tunnel entrance. Shouted commands and the clatter of boots on stone steps indicated that the Territorial Guard had discovered their escape route and was following with dangerous determination. "Can you ride?" Daniel asked Margaret as he lifted Lucy onto the smallest horse. "We all can," Margaret replied, though none of them had ridden much since their father's financial troubles began. "Our parents taught us when we were younger." The horses were well-trained and responsive, obviously selected for their ability to carry inexperienced riders across difficult terrain. Mrs. Rodriguez had thought of everything, demonstrating planning skills that suggested extensive experience. With emergency evacuations, Daniel led them away from the cabin at a pace that balanced speed with safety, knowing that a fall or injury could prove fatal if pursuit caught up to them. The Arkansas River provided both concealment and a navigation landmark, its winding course offering multiple opportunities to confuse trackers. Behind them, Captain Hutchinson's voice carried across the water as the Territorial Guard emerged from the cabin. "There, along the river. They can't be more than 10 minutes ahead." The chase had begun in earnest, with trained cavalry pursuing 3 children and a federal marshal through countryside that offered little concealment. Daniel's knowledge of the region was limited, while Hutchinson presumably knew every trail, creek and hiding place within 50 miles of Millbrook. As their horses splashed across a shallow ford, Sarah looked back toward the smoke rising from Millbrook's chimneys. "Will we ever go home again?" Margaret didn't answer immediately, recognizing that home no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Their parents were dead, their house was sold, and their community had witnessed their public humiliation without effective protest. Even if they survived the current pursuit, return to Millbrook would likely mean capture and resale to the highest bidders. "Home is wherever we're together," Margaret finally replied, echoing words their mother had once spoken during a difficult winter when money was scarce and the future uncertain. The pursuit continued throughout the morning, with the territorial guard maintaining steady pressure while Daniel sought terrain that might provide tactical advantages. The chase was methodical rather than frantic, suggesting that Hutchinson was confident of eventual success and unwilling to risk his horses through excessive haste. Daniel's federal authority meant nothing if he couldn't reach jurisdictional boundaries, where territorial officials had no legal standing. But those boundaries were hundreds of miles away, across terrain controlled by men who viewed federal interference as a threat to profitable local operations. The Henderson sisters were caught between 2 powerful forces: Judge Thornton's corruption network, which wanted to reclaim valuable property, and federal authorities who might protect them if they could survive long enough to receive that protection. As the sun climbed higher, their desperate flight continued through the Kansas wilderness, with 3 orphaned children's freedom hanging in the balance of a pursuit that would determine whether justice or corruption ultimately prevailed in the American frontier. By midday, Daniel realized their flight across open countryside was unsustainable. The horses were tiring rapidly under the August heat, and the Henderson sisters, despite their courage, were showing signs of exhaustion that would soon make continued travel impossible. Captain Hutchinson's pursuit remained relentless, with dust clouds on the horizon indicating the territorial guard was closing the distance steadily. "We need shelter and fresh horses," Daniel told Margaret as they paused beside a creek to water their mounts. "But more importantly, we need allies who understand what we're fighting against." Margaret studied his weathered face, recognizing the same determination that had driven him to outbid their tormentors at the auction. "You have a plan?" "Perhaps," Daniel replied, pulling a well-worn map from his saddlebag. "Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned contacts along the old Underground Railroad routes. People who helped escaped slaves might be willing to help escaped children." The map showed penciled notations marking safe houses, friendly farms, and hidden routes that had once carried human cargo toward freedom in northern states. Many of those locations had been abandoned after the Civil War ended, but some continued operating as refugees for people fleeing various forms of persecution and exploitation. Sarah pointed to their current position along the Arkansas River. "How far to the nearest safe place?" "About 15 miles southeast," Daniel calculated, tracing a route that would take them through broken terrain where pursuit would be more difficult. "There's a settlement called Haven Creek, where abolitionists established a community of freed slaves and sympathetic whites. If it still exists, they might provide sanctuary." The journey to Haven Creek required traveling through increasingly dangerous territory where isolation made them vulnerable to both official pursuit and opportunistic violence. This part of Kansas attracted men who preferred operating beyond the reach of law enforcement, creating an environment where missing travelers raised few questions. As they rode through dense timber along a barely visible trail, Lucy's horse stumbled badly, nearly throwing her from the saddle. The animal was clearly lame, making continued travel impossible without risking serious injury to both horse and rider. "We'll have to double up," Daniel decided, lifting Lucy onto his own mount while turning her injured horse loose to fend for itself. The arrangement slowed their progress considerably and increased the strain on the remaining animals. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer as Captain Hutchinson's men made up ground on their struggling quarry. The Territorial Guard had fresh horses and superior knowledge of local terrain, advantages that made eventual capture seem inevitable unless help appeared soon. The trail emerged from the timber onto a ridge overlooking a small valley where smoke rose from several chimneys, indicating an active settlement. Haven Creek spread below them like a patchwork quilt of small farms, workshops, and residential buildings arranged around a central meeting house. What struck Daniel immediately was the community's obvious prosperity despite its remote location. Fields showed evidence of careful cultivation. Buildings were well maintained, and the entire settlement possessed an air of purposeful organization that suggested strong leadership and shared commitment to common goals. "Is that where we're going?" Sarah asked, pointing toward the cluster of buildings. "If they'll have us," Daniel replied, though he wondered how strangers would be received in a community that had survived by maintaining strict security and careful screening of newcomers. As they descended into the valley, figures emerged from buildings to watch their approach. Daniel noticed immediately that the population was remarkably diverse, including former slaves, white abolitionists, Native Americans, and what appeared to be Mexican families who'd fled various forms of persecution. The community's leader met them at the settlement's edge, a tall black man whose bearing suggested both intelligence and hard-earned authority. His clothes were simple but well-made, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who'd learned to evaluate strangers carefully before extending trust. "I'm Isaiah Washington," the man said, his voice carrying the educated accents of someone who'd received formal schooling despite the obstacles faced by people of his background. "What brings federal marshals and their charges to Haven Creek?" Daniel dismounted and approached with empty hands visible, recognizing that this man commanded respect through demonstrated leadership rather than inherited authority. "Marshal Daniel Whitmore, these children are fugitives from a corrupt legal system that's been selling orphans into industrial slavery. We need sanctuary while I contact federal authorities who can provide proper protection." Isaiah studied the Henderson sisters with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated countless refugees over the years. He could see their exhaustion, fear, and the protective bonds that held them together despite overwhelming circumstances. "Federal marshals aren't usually welcome in communities like ours," Isaiah observed. "Government authority has been used against our people more often than it's been used to help us." The statement was historically accurate and personally understandable, but it created complications Daniel hadn't anticipated. He'd assumed that opponents of slavery would automatically support efforts to rescue children from exploitation. But the situation was more complex than simple moral alignments. These children were sold at public auction to men who would have worked them to death, Daniel explained. "I'm not here representing federal authority. I'm here asking for help protecting innocents from predators who use legal systems to hide their crimes." Margaret stepped forward, recognizing that their fate might depend on her ability to speak for herself and her sisters. "Mr. Washington, we've lost everything. Our parents, our home, our community. All we want is a chance to grow up safely together. We're not asking for charity, just protection while Mr. Whitmore tries to fix the legal problems." Isaiah's expression softened slightly at Margaret's mature articulation of their situation. In communities like Haven Creek, children often developed adult perspectives early due to the harsh realities they faced, making him particularly sensitive to genuine courage in young people. "How many men are pursuing you?" Isaiah asked Daniel, 6 Territorial Guard under Captain Hutchinson, probably less than an hour behind us. They're well armed and operating under orders from territorial officials who want to maintain local control. Over profitable child exploitation. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation as scouts posted around the valley's perimeter signaled the arrival of armed riders. Captain Hutchinson had found their trail and was approaching Haven Creek with his characteristic determination to complete assigned missions regardless of moral considerations. Isaiah made a decision that would affect not only the Henderson sisters, but the entire community's future relationship with territorial authorities. "Samuel!" he called to a young man standing near the meeting house. "Ring the bell 3 times. Everyone to positions." The response was immediate and obviously well rehearsed. Adults disappeared into buildings while emerging with rifles and shotguns. Children were herded into predetermined shelter areas, and defensive positions were occupied with military precision. Haven Creek had clearly faced hostile visitors before and developed effective responses to such threats. "You can fight?" Isaiah asked Daniel as they took positions behind a stone wall that provided cover while commanding views of all approaches to the settlement. "When necessary," Daniel replied, checking his weapons and ammunition. "But I'd prefer avoiding violence if possible. Those men are following orders they believe are legal." "Legal orders have been used to justify terrible crimes against our people," Isaiah replied grimly. "We've learned to judge actions by their moral content rather than their legal authorization." Captain Hutchinson appeared at the valley's rim with his mounted men, their positions silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Even at a distance, their professional bearing and obvious armament created an intimidating presence designed to discourage resistance from civilian populations. "Haven Creek," Hutchinson's voice carried clearly across the valley. "We're pursuing federal fugitives who've taken shelter in your community. Surrender them immediately, and we'll depart without incident." Isaiah stood and walked to a position where he could be clearly seen by the Territorial Guard. His calm demeanor and obvious authority made clear that Haven Creek wouldn't be intimidated by threats or superior numbers. "This is a lawful community operating under territorial charter," Isaiah called back. "We don't harbor fugitives, but we also don't surrender residents to armed men who make demands without proper legal documentation." The exchange highlighted fundamental conflicts between different concepts of law and authority. Hutchinson represented territorial government backed by military force, while Isaiah represented community self-determination based on moral principles and collective decision-making. Daniel watched the confrontation with growing apprehension, realizing that his presence had placed an entire community at risk. The Henderson sisters had already lost one family to legal corruption. He couldn't allow them to be responsible for violence against people who'd offered sanctuary. "I should surrender myself," Daniel told Isaiah quietly. "This community doesn't deserve to suffer for protecting us." "That decision isn't yours to make alone," Isaiah replied. "Haven Creek operates by consensus, and this community has voted to protect people fleeing exploitation regardless of the personal costs." The statement revealed principles that went far beyond simple charity or temporary assistance. Haven Creek represented a systematic commitment to justice that transcended individual safety or convenience, making it a genuine sanctuary for people with nowhere else to turn. As Captain Hutchinson prepared to descend into the valley with obvious hostile intentions, the Henderson sisters huddled together behind the stone wall, wondering if they'd brought destruction to yet another group of people who'd tried to help them. The confrontation was about to escalate beyond words into violence that would determine whether communities like Haven Creek could exist independently, or whether territorial authority would crush all forms of organized resistance to systematic exploitation. Margaret gripped her sister's hands tightly, preparing for whatever came next, while praying that their quest for freedom wouldn't cost more lives than it had already claimed. Captain Hutchinson's patience finally expired as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Haven Creek's defensive positions. His military training told him that prolonged negotiations only allowed enemies to strengthen their positions and coordinate resistance. The time for diplomatic solutions had passed. "Last warning!" Hutchinson shouted across the valley. "Surrender!" The federal fugitives, or face the consequences of obstructing territorial justice. Isaiah Washington remained standing in clear view of the territorial guard, his calm defiance serving as both inspiration to his community and a direct challenge to Hutchinson's authority. Around him, the residents of Haven Creek maintained their defensive positions with quiet determination that spoke of previous confrontations, survived through unity and courage. "We've given you our answer," Isaiah called back. "This community operates under territorial charter and federal law. We don't recognize the authority of armed men making illegal demands." Daniel watched the exchange with growing dread, recognizing the signs of an approaching violent confrontation that would likely result in casualties among people whose only crime was offering sanctuary to endangered children. His federal authority meant nothing in this remote valley where territorial politics and community autonomy intersected in potentially explosive ways. Margaret squeezed her sister's hands tighter as she observed the tension building around them. At 12 years old, she'd already witnessed more violence and cruelty than most adults experience in entire lifetimes. The prospect of watching good people die because they'd offered protection was almost unbearable. "Mr. Washington," Margaret said quietly, "maybe we should leave. These people shouldn't suffer because of us." Isaiah looked down at the brave young girl whose maturity impressed him more with each passing hour. "Child, sometimes standing up to evil requires accepting risks that seem unfair. But if good people don't protect each other, evil wins by default." The philosophical lesson was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats as Captain Hutchinson began his descent into the valley with 3 of his men, leaving 2 positioned on the ridge as potential snipers. The tactical deployment suggested he intended to use overwhelming force rather than continued negotiation. But as the territorial guard approached Haven Creek's perimeter, unexpected complications arose that would change the entire dynamic of the confrontation. A dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon, indicating the approach of additional riders whose identity and intentions remained unknown. Hutchinson noticed the new arrivals immediately, his military instincts recognizing that reinforcements could dramatically alter the tactical situation. He signaled his men to halt their advance while determining whether the approaching riders represented threats or opportunities. The new group consisted of 12 mounted men wearing the blue uniforms of the United States cavalry, led by a weathered officer whose bearing suggested extensive combat experience. As they crested the ridge overlooking Haven Creek, their commander surveyed the tense standoff with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating complex tactical situations. "Captain Hutchinson!" the cavalry officer called out. "This is Major William Patterson, 2nd Kansas Cavalry. You will withdraw your men immediately and report to territorial headquarters for reassignment." Hutchinson's confident expression crumbled as he recognized the implications of federal military intervention. Major Patterson's authority superseded territorial jurisdiction, making continued pursuit of the Henderson sisters a violation of federal law rather than an enforcement of territorial justice. "Major Patterson," Hutchinson replied, trying to maintain dignity while acknowledging superior authority. "We're conducting lawful operations under territorial authorization. Federal interference is neither requested nor welcome." Patterson's laugh carried no humor as he gestured toward his uniformed men. "Captain, you're pursuing a federal marshal who's conducting an authorized investigation into child trafficking. Your territorial authorization means nothing when federal crimes are involved. The revelation that Daniel's investigation had been officially recognized by federal authorities changed everything about the legal and political dynamics surrounding the Henderson sisters' case. What had appeared to be a rogue marshal's unauthorized intervention was actually part of a coordinated federal response to systematic corruption throughout the Western Territories. Isaiah Washington allowed himself a slight smile as he observed Hutchinson's growing discomfort. Federal military support meant Haven Creek wouldn't have to face territorial retaliation alone, providing protection that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Daniel emerged from behind the defensive positions with visible relief, recognizing Major Patterson from previous cooperation between federal marshals and military units. The cavalry officer's arrival meant not only immediate protection for the Henderson sisters, but also validation of the investigation that had consumed months of dangerous undercover work. "Major Patterson," Daniel said as he approached the federal officers, "I have 3 children who were rescued from illegal auction and considerable evidence of interstate trafficking operations that require immediate federal intervention." Patterson dismounted and shook Daniel's hand with obvious respect. "Marshal Whitmore, your reports have already triggered investigations in 4 territories. Judge Thornton and his associates are about to discover that federal authority extends much further than they imagined." The Major's words carried implications that went far beyond the Henderson sisters' immediate situation. Federal investigations into child trafficking had apparently identified a network of corruption that extended across multiple jurisdictions, with Thornton's auctions representing only one component of a larger criminal enterprise. Captain Hutchinson found himself in an increasingly untenable position as federal authority superseded his territorial orders. Continuing pursuit would mean direct confrontation with United States military forces, an escalation that could end his career and potentially result in criminal charges. "This is highly irregular," Hutchinson protested, though his tone suggested acceptance of defeat rather than continued defiance. "Territorial officials will demand explanations for federal interference in local governance. Territorial officials will receive detailed explanations when they're arrested for violating federal laws regarding interstate commerce and child welfare," Patterson replied coldly. "Your pursuit ends here, Captain. Withdraw your men and consider yourself fortunate that I don't place you under arrest for obstruction of federal investigations." As the Territorial Guard retreated with obvious reluctance, the residents of Haven Creek emerged from their defensive positions with celebrations that reflected both relief and vindication. Their decision to protect the Henderson sisters had proven morally correct and politically wise, strengthening their community's reputation as a genuine sanctuary for endangered people. Margaret, Sarah, and Lucy watched the federal cavalry with mixtures of hope and lingering apprehension. Too many adults had disappointed them recently for complete trust to return immediately, but Major Patterson's intervention suggested that justice might actually exist within legal systems they'd learned to fear. "What happens to us now?" Margaret asked Daniel as the immediate crisis subsided. "Now we complete the investigation that began when you were put up for auction," Daniel replied. "Your testimony will help prosecute Judge Thornton, Vincent Morrison, and everyone else involved in trafficking children throughout the territories." The prospect of testifying against their tormentors was both empowering and terrifying for the Henderson sisters. They would have opportunities to ensure that other children didn't suffer similar fates, but doing so would require reliving traumatic experiences and potentially facing retaliation from powerful enemies. Major Patterson approached, the children with the gentle demeanor of someone who understood trauma and its lasting effects on young minds. "Girls, I know you've been through terrible experiences, but your courage in surviving them has already helped save other children from similar fates." Isaiah Washington joined the conversation, offering perspectives that reflected his community's collective wisdom about healing and justice. "Children, you've learned that sometimes good people must stand up to evil even when it's dangerous. That's exactly what you'll be doing if you help prosecute the people who hurt you." As evening approached, Haven Creek transformed from a besieged community into a place of celebration and fellowship. Federal protection meant residents could openly discuss their experiences with persecution and their commitment to protecting others facing similar challenges. The Henderson sisters found themselves surrounded by people who understood loss, displacement, and the struggle to rebuild lives after devastating setbacks. Former slaves shared stories of families separated by auctions, not unlike the one that had nearly destroyed the Henderson girls. Mexican refugees described fleeing violence and finding sanctuary in communities that valued human dignity over legal technicalities, but the day's events had also revealed the broader scope of corruption that extended far beyond Judge Thornton's individual crimes. Vincent Morrison's professional gambling operations, Samuel Pierce's industrial exploitation of children, Jeremiah Walsh's isolated farm where young workers disappeared, all represented components of a systematic network that generated enormous profits through human suffering. Daniel spent the evening briefing Major Patterson on evidence collected during months of undercover investigation. The scope of documentation was staggering. Financial records, witness testimonies, photographs of working conditions, and correspondence between officials who'd coordinated trafficking operations across multiple territories. "How many children are we talking about?" Patterson asked as he reviewed Daniel's detailed reports. "Hundreds, possibly thousands over the past few years," Daniel replied grimly. "Every major town in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado has conducted similar auctions. The profits are enormous, and the political protection extends all the way to territorial capitals. The numbers represented a humanitarian crisis that demanded federal intervention on a scale that would shock the public and potentially destabilize territorial governments throughout the region. But such interventions were necessary to protect vulnerable children and restore public faith in legal systems designed to serve justice rather than exploitation. As the Henderson sisters settled into comfortable beds provided by Haven Creek's hospitality, they faced an uncertain but hopeful future. Federal protection meant they were safe from immediate recapture, but their ultimate fate would depend on legal proceedings that could take months or years to complete. Margaret lay awake, listening to her sister's peaceful breathing, finally allowing herself to believe that their nightmare might actually be ending. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began the difficult process of testifying against their tormentors, but for tonight they were safe together and surrounded by people who understood the value of protecting innocence from those who would exploit them. The standoff at Haven Creek had ended in victory for justice over corruption, but the larger battle for children's welfare throughout the American frontier was just beginning. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Haven Creek, the Henderson sisters found themselves in the imposing federal courthouse in Kansas City, their small hands placed on leather-bound Bibles as they prepared to testify against the men who had nearly destroyed their lives. The courtroom was packed with journalists, federal officials, and representatives from territories across the American West, all gathered to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Margaret stood at the witness stand first, her 12-year-old frame dwarfed by the massive oak furniture and soaring ceilings of the federal building. But her voice carried clearly as she described the events that had torn her family apart and nearly condemned her and her sisters to lives of exploitation and servitude. Judge Thornton called us property. Margaret testified, her eyes fixed on the federal prosecutor who'd spent hours preparing her for this moment. He said we were assets, to be sold, to pay our father's debts. When men bid on us, he talked about our bodies and our labor like we were livestock at market. Judge Ezekiel Thornton sat at the defendant's table wearing the same black robes that had once symbolized legal authority, but now seemed to mock the justice he'd perverted for personal gain. His face remained impassive as Margaret's testimony revealed the calculated cruelty behind his seemingly legal proceedings. Beside Thornton sat Vincent Morrison, the professional gambler whose manipulation of desperate fathers had generated dozens of orphaned children for the trafficking network. Morrison's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by obvious anxiety as federal prosecutors presented evidence of his systematic destruction of families across multiple territories. The third defendant, Samuel Pierce, shifted uncomfortably as Margaret described seeing his textile mill during their journey to Haven Creek. Federal investigators had raided Pierce's facilities and discovered working conditions so horrific that even hardened lawmen had been sickened by what they found. Mr. Pierce told Judge Thornton he needed young workers because their small hands could operate machinery that adult workers couldn't reach. Margaret continued, but we heard other children in his mill had lost fingers or been killed when the machines caught their clothing. Federal prosecutor James Bradley had built his case methodically over months of investigation, gathering evidence that revealed the scope and sophistication of the child trafficking network. Financial records showed millions of dollars in profits, generated through the systematic exploitation of orphaned children, with corruption extending into territorial governments, federal agencies, and interstate commerce operations. Miss Henderson, Prosecutor Bradley said gently, can you describe what you believed would happen to you and your sisters if Marshal Whitmore hadn't intervened at the auction? Margaret's composure cracked slightly as she considered the question. Sarah would have gone to Jeremiah Walsh's farm. We heard that children who went there were never seen again. Lucy would have been sent to Mr. Pierce's mill, where she probably would have been hurt or killed by the machinery, and I would have gone to Silas Blackwood's ranch, where workers were beaten and starved. The defense attorneys, led by the expensive legal team hired by territorial officials who wanted to limit federal intervention, attempted to portray the defendants as men operating within legal frameworks established by territorial law. Their arguments focused on jurisdictional disputes rather than moral considerations, claiming that federal courts had no authority over local governance decisions. Miss Henderson, defense attorney Robert Sterling said during cross-examination, isn't it true that the auction was conducted according to territorial statutes regarding debt settlement and child welfare? Margaret looked confused by the legal language until Prosecutor Bradley explained the question in simpler terms. Then, her response cut through jurisdictional technicalities with devastating clarity. They were selling us like animals, Margaret said firmly. I don't care what laws they said allowed it. Nobody should be able to buy children. Sarah's testimony proved equally powerful, despite her quieter personality and obvious nervousness about speaking in public. The 10-year-old described the terror of standing on the auction platform while strange men evaluated her potential value as a worker, and the relief of seeing Daniel Whitmore outbid the predators who'd wanted to purchase her. Mr. Walsh looked at me like I was something he wanted to hurt, Sarah said, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the silent courtroom. When Mr. Whitmore bid more money, Mr. Walsh got angry like someone had taken away his toy. Lucy's testimony was limited due to her age, but her few words provided emotional impact that legal arguments couldn't match. When asked to describe her feelings during the auction, the 8-year-old's simple response silenced the entire courtroom. I wanted my mama, Lucy said, tears streaming down her face. But Mama was dead. And Papa was dead, and nobody cared about us except the man who bought us. Federal investigators had also located dozens of other children who'd been sold through similar auctions, many of them rescued from working conditions that amounted to slavery. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic abuse that extended across multiple territories and involved hundreds of officials who'd profited from legal human trafficking. Dr. Emily Foster, a federal child welfare expert, provided professional assessment of the psychological damage inflicted on auction victims. Her research had documented cases of children who'd been permanently traumatized by experiences similar to those endured by the Henderson sisters. Children sold in these auctions suffer trauma equivalent to prisoners of war, Dr. Foster testified. They're subjected to public humiliation, family separation, and the constant threat of violence or exploitation. The psychological damage often lasts for years or even decades. Daniel Whitmore's testimony provided the federal perspective on an investigation that had consumed months of dangerous undercover work. His detailed documentation of corruption networks, financial records, and systematic violations of federal law demonstrated the scope of criminal enterprise hidden behind legal technicalities. This wasn't isolated criminal behavior, Daniel explained to the jury. This was an organized network that identified vulnerable families, destroyed them through manipulated gambling operations, and sold the resulting orphaned children to buyers who had no interest in their welfare. The marshal's evidence included correspondence between Judge Thornton and territorial officials who'd protected the trafficking operations in exchange for political support and financial considerations. Letters revealed casual discussions about generating inventory and expanding markets that treated children as commodities rather than human beings. Isaiah Washington traveled from Haven Creek to testify about his community's experience with refugees fleeing similar exploitation. His powerful testimony about the Underground Railroad's continued relevance in protecting vulnerable populations added historical context to contemporary crimes. "We thought the Underground Railroad's mission ended with slavery's abolition," Isaiah said, "but these trials prove that different forms of human trafficking continue to threaten innocent people, particularly children who can't protect themselves." As the trial progressed through 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments, the defendants' facade of legitimacy crumbled under federal scrutiny. Financial records revealed bribes paid to territorial officials. Correspondence showed coordination between supposed competitors, and witness testimony documented systematic abuse that defied legal justification. The defense team's attempts to claim jurisdictional immunity failed when federal prosecutors demonstrated that interstate commerce laws applied to trafficking operations that crossed territorial boundaries. Children sold in Kansas had been transported to mines in Colorado, factories in Missouri, and ranches in Nebraska, making the crimes federal offenses regardless of local legal interpretations. Public opinion, initially divided about federal intervention in territorial governance, shifted dramatically as testimony revealed the scope and cruelty of the trafficking network. Newspaper coverage transformed defendants from respected officials into symbols of systematic corruption that demanded federal prosecution. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez traveled from the Riverside Inn to testify about her experience helping endangered children and families. Her account of the Underground Railroad tunnels and emergency evacuation procedures provided evidence of the community networks that had developed to protect trafficking victims. "These children weren't the first we've helped escape from legal slavery," Mrs. Rodriguez testified. "Families throughout the territories know that certain judges and officials will sell their children if given any excuse. We've learned to help people disappear before the auctions can happen." The revelation that entire communities had organized resistance to legal child trafficking demonstrated the widespread recognition that territorial laws were being used to justify humanitarian crimes. Federal intervention wasn't overreach, but necessary response to systematic violations of fundamental human rights. As the prosecution concluded its case, the evidence presented painted a picture of corruption so extensive and cruelty so systematic that even the defendant's expensive legal team struggled to mount effective defenses. The Henderson sisters had not been isolated victims, but symbols of hundreds of children whose lives had been destroyed by adults who'd perverted legal systems for personal profit. The federal courthouse had become a battleground between competing visions of American justice, one that prioritized local autonomy regardless of moral considerations, and another that demanded federal protection for vulnerable populations who couldn't protect themselves. The Henderson sisters watched from the gallery as closing arguments began, knowing that their courage in testifying had helped expose crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Their ordeal was finally approaching resolution, but the broader implications of the trial would reshape territorial governance and federal authority throughout the American West. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with verdicts that would echo throughout the Western territories for generations. As the 12 men filed back into the Kansas City federal courthouse, their grim expressions left no doubt about their conclusions regarding the systematic trafficking of orphaned children. Judge Harrison Wesley, the federal magistrate presiding over the trial, called for order, as spectators packed every available seat to witness the conclusion of proceedings that had captivated the nation's attention. Newspaper reporters positioned themselves strategically to document verdicts that would reshape territorial governance and federal authority. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Wesley asked. Jury foreman Thomas McCready, a Kansas farmer whose own children had been threatened by similar circumstances, stood with obvious emotion. "We have, Your Honor." The Henderson sisters sat in the front row between Daniel Whitmore and Mrs. Rodriguez, their small hands clasped tightly together as they prepared to hear whether their courage in testifying would result in justice for themselves and the countless other children who'd suffered similar exploitation. On the charge of conspiracy to violate federal interstate commerce laws, how do you find the defendant Ezekiel Thornton? "Guilty, Your Honor." On the charge of operating an illegal trafficking enterprise, how do you find the defendant Vincent Morrison? "Guilty, Your Honor." On the charge of conspiracy to exploit child labor in violation of federal statutes, how do you find the defendant Samuel Pierce? "Guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers as each guilty verdict was announced, while the defendants sat in stunned silence as their carefully constructed defense strategies crumbled under the weight of overwhelming evidence. Years of systematic corruption had finally been exposed and punished through federal justice. Judge Wesley restored order before delivering sentences that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the need to deter similar enterprises throughout the frontier territories. Each defendant faced decades in federal prison, with financial penalties that would bankrupt their operations and compensate victims for damages suffered. "Ezekiel Thornton," Judge Wesley announced, "you have perverted the sacred trust of judicial authority to profit from the systematic exploitation of orphaned children. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, with restitution payments totaling $50,000 to be distributed among documented victims." Thornton's face went ashen as he realized that his comfortable retirement plans had been replaced by the prospect of dying in federal custody. The former judge, who'd wielded power over countless families, now faced the same helplessness he'd inflicted on the children he'd sold. "Vincent Morrison, your manipulation of vulnerable families represents premeditated cruelty that defies civilized behavior. This court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison, with additional restitution requirements and permanent prohibition from operating gambling enterprises in any territory or state." Morrison's legendary composure finally cracked as federal Marshals prepared to escort him to custody. The professional gambler who destroyed dozens of families through calculated psychological manipulation would spend his remaining years experiencing the powerlessness he'd inflicted on others. Samuel Pierce, your industrial exploitation of children purchased through illegal auctions resulted in documented deaths and permanent disabilities among victims who deserved protection rather than abuse. This court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison with mandatory closure of all textile operations and compensation for families of children killed or injured in your facilities. Pierce's textile empire, built on the blood and suffering of children too young to protect themselves, would be dismantled completely. Federal investigators would ensure that his factories could never again serve as destinations for trafficked children. As the verdicts concluded, federal prosecutor Bradley announced that this trial represented only the beginning of comprehensive reforms designed to protect vulnerable children throughout the American frontier. Federal authorities are establishing permanent child welfare offices in every territory, Bradley declared. Never again will children face auction blocks or systematic exploitation while legal systems turn away from their suffering. For the Hendersons sisters, the verdicts represented vindication of their courage in testifying against powerful men who'd tried to reduce them to property. Their willingness to relive traumatic experiences had helped ensure that other children wouldn't face similar fates, but legal victory created opportunities rather than obligations regarding their future. Daniel Whitmore's protection had evolved from professional duty into genuine family affection, while communities that had supported them offered permanent homes filled with love and security. "What happens to us now?" Margaret asked Daniel as they left the courthouse surrounded by celebrating supporters. Daniel knelt to address all three sisters at eye level, his expression showing the deep emotion that months of shared challenges had created. "Now you get to choose your own future. But first, I have something important to ask you." He paused, clearly struggling with emotions that went far beyond professional responsibility. "These past months, you three have become the daughters I never thought I'd have. If you're willing, I'd like to make that official. I want to adopt you as my family." The sisters looked at each other with wonder and growing joy as they realized that the man who'd saved them from auction was offering something they'd never dared hope for. A real father who wanted them not as workers or burdens, but as beloved children. "You mean we'd be your daughters forever?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with amazement. "Forever and always," Daniel confirmed, "with education, opportunities, and all the love and protection any children could ever need." Margaret stepped forward as spokesman for her sisters, her mature wisdom evident in her careful consideration of such an important decision. "Mr. Whitmore, you saved us when no one else would. You risked your life to protect us. We'd be honored to be your daughters." The three-way embrace that followed brought tears to every eye in the courthouse corridor, as spectators witnessed the transformation of a rescue mission into the formation of a genuine family. Love had triumphed over exploitation, creating bonds that would last for lifetimes. Mrs. Rodriguez approached with her own announcement that would ensure the sisters' future security and purpose. "The Riverside Inn is being transformed into a permanent sanctuary for children escaping exploitation. Your family will always have a home there, and you can help other children who face situations like yours." Isaiah Washington added, "Haven Creek's commitment to supporting their extended family. Our community will always be your community. You've proven that courage and love can overcome any challenge." 6 months later, the Whitmore family had settled into a comfortable home near the Riverside Inn, where Daniel continued his federal investigations while the sisters pursued their education with enthusiasm that amazed their teachers. Margaret excelled in mathematics and literature, Sarah discovered talents in music and art, while Lucy's natural compassion made her beloved by younger children who found sanctuary at the inn. The trust fund, established from confiscated trafficking proceeds, provided not only financial security, but resources to help other endangered children. The Henderson sisters, now the Whitmore daughters, had become advocates for child welfare throughout the Western Territories. Their story inspired federal legislation that established child protection standards, mandatory education requirements, and legal prohibitions against debt-related auctions involving minors. The Henderson Act, passed by Congress 2 years after their rescue, created permanent safeguards that would protect generations of vulnerable children. On quiet evenings, the Whitmore family would gather around their fireplace while Daniel read stories aloud or helped with homework. These moments of domestic tranquility represented victories that transcended legal proceedings or political reforms. They represented the triumph of love over cruelty, family over exploitation, hope over despair. Margaret, now 14 and preparing for advanced education that would lead to a career in law, often reflected on the journey that had brought them from auction blocks to family security. Her experiences had taught her that justice required constant vigilance and that protecting the vulnerable was everyone's responsibility. Sarah, 12 and talented in music composition, used her artistic abilities to tell stories of children who'd survived similar challenges. Her songs and drawings provided inspiration for other young people facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Lucy, 10 and wise beyond her years, had become the unofficial greeter for new children arriving at the Riverside Inn's sanctuary programs. Her gentle spirit and understanding of trauma helped newcomers begin their own healing journeys. Daniel watched his daughters with pride that went far beyond their individual accomplishments. They'd survived systematic cruelty with their spirits intact, transformed personal tragedy into community service, and demonstrated that children possess strength and wisdom that adults often underestimated. The man who'd purchased 3 sisters at auction to save them from exploitation had discovered that rescuing them had rescued him as well. His life had gained meaning and purpose that professional achievements could never provide, while their love had healed wounds he'd carried for years. Federal investigations continued throughout the territories, identifying and prosecuting trafficking networks while establishing protective services for vulnerable families. The Henderson sisters' courage had created ripple effects that extended far beyond their individual case, inspiring social reforms that would protect countless other children. As autumn returned to Kansas 5 years after that terrible August auction, the Whitmore family visited the Millbrook Cemetery, where Thomas and Catherine Henderson rested in peace. The sisters placed flowers on their parents' graves while reflecting on how dramatically their lives had changed since that dark period of loss and desperation. "Do you think they'd be proud of us?" Lucy asked, her voice thoughtful as she arranged wildflowers around the headstone. "I know they would," Margaret replied firmly. "We survived, we stayed together, and we're helping other children avoid what we went through. That's exactly what they would have wanted." Daniel stood quietly nearby, understanding that this moment represented closure for traumatic experiences that had shaped his daughter's characters in profound ways. Their parents' deaths had been tragic, but the strength and compassion those experiences had developed would serve them throughout their lives. The sun set over Millbrook with golden light that seemed to bless the small family gathered in the cemetery. 3 sisters, who'd once faced auction blocks as orphaned property, were now beloved daughters with bright futures and the security of knowing they'd never again face such challenges alone. Their story had shocked the territory, but not because of the cruelty they'd endured. It had shocked people because of the courage they'd demonstrated, the love they'd preserved, and the justice they'd helped achieve. They'd proven that even in humanity's darkest moments, light could emerge to guide others toward hope, healing, and the recognition that every child deserved protection, love, and the chance to choose their own destiny. The Henderson sisters had found their forever family, and in doing so, had helped countless other children find theirs as well. Their legacy would live on in the lives they'd saved, the laws they'd inspired, and the simple truth they'd demonstrated, that love, courage, and justice could triumph over any evil that threatened innocent lives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.